This is Dr. Wesley Grant broadcasting on emergency frequency 7.185. If you're hearing this, then the communication networks are still functioning, and there's still time to document what's happening beneath Yellowstone National Park. I've been a volcanologist for 15 years, spent the last decade monitoring the sleeping giant that lies beneath Wyoming's pristine wilderness. What I'm about to tell you isn't speculation or fear-mongering. It's scientific observation of a geological process that has repeated itself 3 times in the past 2.1 million years. Most people don't realize that Yellowstone isn't just a national park. It's the surface expression of one of Earth's most massive volcanic systems, a supervolcano that has shaped continents and altered global climate throughout geological history. The Huckleberry Ridge eruption, 2.1 million years ago, released 600 times more material than Mount St. Helens. The Mesa Falls eruption, 1.3 million years ago, carved landscapes that still define the region today. The most recent, the Lava Creek eruption, 640,000 years ago, created the current caldera and deposited ash from Mexico to Canada. For the past 7 days, I've been recording unprecedented changes in the Yellowstone system. The seismic monitoring stations are registering activity that exceeds anything in our historical record. We typically see 1,000 to 3,000 earthquakes per year in the Yellowstone region. In the past week, we've recorded over 400 earthquakes daily. These aren't random tremors. They're following specific patterns that indicate massive movement in the magma chamber beneath the caldera. The ground deformation measurements are equally disturbing. The Yellowstone caldera floor has been rising at approximately 6 inches per year for the past 3 years. This rate is unprecedented in our observational history. When I started monitoring this system, we considered 2 inches per year significant. The GPS stations positioned around the caldera are showing radial expansion, as if something enormous is pushing upward from below. The mathematical models suggest a volume of magma equivalent to several Mount St. Helens eruptions is moving toward the surface. Yesterday morning, I drove through the park to conduct field observations. The changes are visible to anyone willing to look carefully. Old Faithful, which has maintained its approximately 90-minute eruption cycle for over a century, has become erratic. Instead of its reliable schedule, it's erupting every 30 to 40 minutes, with heights reaching 200 feet instead of the usual 130. The water temperature in the geyser pools has increased by 15 degrees Fahrenheit in just the past month. New thermal features are appearing overnight where none existed before. Springs that have remained dormant for thousands of years are suddenly boiling. I discovered 3 new geysers along the Grand Loop Road that weren't there last week. The ground around these new features is soft and hot, sometimes too hot to stand on for more than a few seconds. The mineral deposits forming around these springs indicate water temperatures exceeding 200 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface level. The wildlife behavior is perhaps the most unsettling indicator. Bison herds that have occupied the same territories for generations are moving south en masse. I've witnessed over 3,000 bison crossing park boundaries in unprecedented migrations. The elk populations are following similar patterns, abandoning their traditional grazing areas. Even the smaller mammals are fleeing. Rodent populations around thermal areas have virtually disappeared, and bird species that typically nest near hot springs have abandoned their rookeries. The atmospheric chemistry around Yellowstone has changed dramatically. Hydrogen sulfide concentrations have increased tenfold in the past month. This gas, which creates the distinctive rotten egg smell, is typically present at low levels around geothermal areas. The current concentrations are approaching dangerous thresholds for human exposure. Park visitors have reported headaches, nausea, and respiratory irritation after spending time in certain areas of the park. Yellowstone Lake presents perhaps the most disturbing evidence of the changes occurring below. The lake's average temperature has risen 15 degrees in 2 weeks. This massive body of water, covering 136 square miles, doesn't change temperature quickly under normal circumstances. Fish populations are experiencing massive die-offs. The lake's surface is covered with floating carcasses of trout, creating an apocalyptic scene that park officials are struggling to manage. The water itself has become slightly acidic due to dissolved volcanic gases. Ground fissures are opening throughout the park, releasing superheated steam and gases. These cracks appear overnight, sometimes spanning several hundred yards in length. The steam emerging from these fissures has been measured at temperatures exceeding 300 degrees Fahrenheit. 3 hikers required hospitalization yesterday after exposure to volcanic gases near one of these new fissures. The symptoms included severe respiratory distress and chemical burns to exposed skin. The magnetic field measurements around Yellowstone are showing anomalies consistent with large-scale underground thermal changes. The Earth's magnetic field varies slightly based on subsurface temperature and mineral composition. The readings I'm getting suggest temperatures at depth are hundreds of degrees higher than normal baselines. This indicates massive thermal input from rising magma. Satellite thermal imagery confirms what ground-based instruments are measuring. The surface temperature across the entire Yellowstone caldera has increased by an average of 20 degrees over the past month. This warming is not uniform, but concentrated in specific areas that correspond to known fault systems and previous eruption sites. The thermal signature is expanding daily, covering larger areas of the park. The implications of these combined observations are inescapable. The Yellowstone volcanic system is entering an active phase that could culminate in an eruption. The patterns we're seeing match historical geological evidence from previous supervolcanic events worldwide. The Toba eruption 74,000 years ago in Indonesia created a volcanic winter that nearly drove humanity to extinction. The Long Valley eruption 760,000 years ago in California devastated the western United States. I'm broadcasting this information because the public deserves to understand what's happening beneath their feet. The media coverage has been minimal, focusing on increased tourist interest rather than the scientific implications. Government agencies are downplaying the significance of these changes, describing them as normal fluctuations in an active geothermal system. This characterization is scientifically inaccurate and potentially dangerous. The Yellowstone magma chamber contains approximately 15,000 cubic miles of molten and semi-molten rock. Even a fraction of this material reaching the surface would create catastrophic consequences. The blast radius of a major Yellowstone eruption would devastate everything within 600 miles. Ashfall would blanket most of the continental United States, disrupting agriculture, transportation, and human habitation for years. My colleague at the United States Geological Survey called 30 minutes ago with disturbing news. The real-time seismic data is showing harmonic tremor patterns consistent with magma movement. These rhythmic vibrations occur when molten rock flows through underground channels. The frequency and amplitude of these tremors suggest massive volumes of magma approaching the surface. The last time we recorded similar patterns was at Mount St. Helens, weeks before its catastrophic eruption. The atmospheric pressure around Yellowstone has begun fluctuating in ways that correlate with underground activity. These pressure changes, while subtle, indicate gas release from the magma chamber. As magma rises toward the surface, dissolved gases expand and escape, creating pressure waves detectable by sensitive instruments. The rate of gas release has increased exponentially over the past 72 hours. I need to relocate my broadcasting equipment. The area around my current position has become unstable, with new thermal features appearing within a few hundred yards of my research station. The ground temperature beneath my feet has increased noticeably since this morning. If you're listening to this broadcast, pay attention to official evacuation orders when they come. The geological processes unfolding beneath Yellowstone operate on their own timeline, indifferent to human presence or preparation. This concludes my first emergency broadcast. I'll continue transmitting as conditions allow, documenting the awakening of North America's greatest natural hazard. Remember, this isn't the first time Yellowstone has erupted, and the geological record suggests it won't be the last. What we're witnessing is part of Earth's natural rhythm, a reminder of the powerful forces that shape our planet over geological timescales. This is Dr. Wesley Grant, broadcasting from a temporary station 200 miles south of Yellowstone. If you heard my previous transmission, you know I've been documenting the unprecedented geological activity beneath the park. What I'm about to describe happened 18 hours ago, and I'm still struggling to process the magnitude of what I witnessed. At 7:42 a.m. Mountain Time yesterday, the Yellowstone Supervolcano erupted with a force that defies human comprehension. The eruption began with a magnitude 7.3 earthquake that I felt even at my monitoring station 60 miles away. The seismic waves traveled through the ground like ripples in water, but these ripples could topple buildings and crack bedrock. Within seconds of the earthquake, the entire western horizon turned black. The eruption column rose at speeds exceeding 1,000 feet per second, punching through the atmosphere like a spear thrust into the sky. From my vantage point, the eruption column appeared as a towering pillar of darkness that stretched beyond the visible atmosphere. Satellite data later confirmed that the column reached heights of 50 miles above sea level, well into the stratosphere where commercial aircraft cruise. The column wasn't uniform, but twisted and writhed like a living thing, illuminated from within by continuous volcanic lightning. These electrical discharges occurred every few seconds, creating a strobe effect that revealed the massive scale of the ash cloud spreading overhead. The sound arrived approximately 3 minutes after the visual explosion, traveling at the speed of sound across the landscape. It wasn't a single boom, but a continuous roar that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. Windows shattered in buildings 50 miles away from the eruption. The acoustic energy was so intense that it triggered avalanches in mountain ranges hundreds of miles from Yellowstone. Seismic stations recorded the sound waves as they traveled across the North American continent, reaching the Atlantic and Pacific coasts within hours. The initial blast ejected an estimated 40 cubic miles of magma, rock, and ash in the first 6 hours. To put this in perspective, Mount St. Helens ejected approximately 1 cubic mile of material during its entire eruption sequence. The Yellowstone eruption was releasing the equivalent of a Mount St. Helens eruption every 9 minutes during its opening phase. The material ejected included chunks of basement rock, that had been solid for millions of years, suddenly vaporized and hurled into the stratosphere by temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Pyroclastic flows began racing outward from the eruption center within minutes of the initial blast. These superheated avalanches of gas, ash, and rock moved at speeds approaching 450 miles per hour, faster than any vehicle could outrun them. The flows followed valley systems and low-lying areas, incinerating everything in their path. Trees that had survived forest fires, floods, and centuries of harsh weather were reduced to charcoal stumps in seconds. The flows generated their own weather systems, creating tornado-like vortices that lifted cars and buildings into the air. The thermal energy released during the first hour of the eruption exceeded the total annual energy consumption of the United States. This heat vaporized snow and ice across the entire Yellowstone region, creating massive steam clouds that merged with the volcanic ash column. Rivers and lakes within a 100-mile radius began boiling, killing all aquatic life instantly. The Yellowstone River itself became a channel of superheated steam and ash, carrying volcanic debris downstream at incredible speeds. As the eruption continued, the caldera floor began collapsing into the emptying magma chamber below. This collapse wasn't gradual, but occurred in massive chunks, each collapse generating earthquakes that registered above magnitude 6.0. The sound of the collapsing caldera could be heard over the volcanic roar, a deep rumbling that seemed to come from the planet's core. The collapse created a crater 30 miles across and several thousand feet deep, swallowing entire mountain ranges and forest ecosystems. The ash cloud began spreading eastward with the prevailing winds, moving at speeds of 60 miles per hour at altitude. Within 6 hours, ash began falling in Denver, Colorado, 300 miles from the eruption site. The ash wasn't the fine powder that people might imagine, but a mixture of glass particles, crystalline fragments, and pulverized rock. When inhaled, this ash caused immediate respiratory distress, cutting lung tissue like microscopic razor blades. Hospitals in Denver reported hundreds of cases of acute respiratory failure within hours of the ash fall beginning. Denver International Airport ceased operations when the ash fall reached 1-inch depth on runways. Aircraft engines cannot function when ingesting volcanic ash, as the particles melt in the high-temperature combustion chambers and solidify on turbine blades. Every aircraft in the region was grounded indefinitely. The ash also began short-circuiting electrical systems throughout Colorado, as the conductive particles created pathways for electrical current between power lines and transformers. Interstate highways became death traps as visibility dropped to zero and ash accumulated on road surfaces. The ash mixed with moisture in the air to create a concrete-like substance that clogged air filters and cooling systems in vehicles. Thousands of motorists found themselves stranded as their cars overheated and engines seized. Emergency services were overwhelmed and unable to reach most stranded travelers due to the same conditions affecting their own vehicles. The psychological impact of the eruption was as devastating as the physical destruction. People throughout the western United States watched their televisions as the ash cloud approached their communities like a slow-moving tidal wave of darkness. The cloud was visible from space, a brown stain spreading across the continent that grew larger with each satellite image. Agricultural regions began experiencing immediate impacts as ash fall contaminated crops and grazing land. Livestock that remained outside during the initial ash fall suffered severe respiratory distress, and many died within hours. The abrasive particles stripped leaves from plants and coated soil surfaces, making photosynthesis impossible for surviving vegetation. Farmers watched decades of work disappear under inches of volcanic debris that turned fertile fields into barren wastelands. Water systems throughout the affected region became contaminated with volcanic ash and chemical compounds. Municipal water treatment plants were not designed to handle the volume and composition of volcanic contamination. The ash clogged filtration systems, while dissolved volcanic gases made water acidic and potentially toxic. Millions of people found themselves without access to safe drinking water as treatment facilities shut down to prevent equipment damage. The eruption's impact on global atmospheric chemistry began immediately. Sulfur dioxide gas injected into the stratosphere started forming aerosol particles that reflected sunlight back into space. Global average temperatures began dropping within days as less solar energy reached Earth's surface. Weather patterns shifted as the massive ash cloud disrupted normal atmospheric circulation. Monsoon systems that billions of people depend upon for agriculture began showing signs of disruption. Communication systems started failing as ash particles interfered with radio waves and satellite signals. Cell phone towers became coated with conductive ash, creating electrical problems that knocked out service across multiple states. Internet infrastructure began degrading as data centers struggled with cooling system failures caused by ash infiltration. The modern connected world was discovering how vulnerable it was to geological forces that operated on scales beyond technological solutions. Secondary eruptions began occurring around the main vent as the magma chamber continued draining. These smaller eruptions, each equivalent to a major volcanic event by historical standards, opened new fissures and created additional ash columns. The eruption was not a single event, but the beginning of a sustained volcanic crisis that showed no signs of diminishing. Seismic data indicated that vast quantities of magma remained in the chamber, suggesting weeks or months of continued eruption activity. My own situation became precarious as ashfall reached my temporary broadcast location. The ash accumulated on my equipment, interfering with radio transmission and threatening to damage sensitive instruments. I made the decision to relocate further south, abandoning some monitoring equipment that had provided valuable data during the eruption's initial phases. The retreat felt like abandoning a scientific duty, but continuing documentation required preserving the means of communication. As I prepare to sign off this transmission, ash is beginning to fall here, 200 miles from the eruption site. The particles drift down like gray snow, covering everything with a fine layer of volcanic glass. Each particle represents rock that was solid yesterday morning, but was vaporized and launched 50 miles into the sky by forces that dwarf human technology. This is only the beginning of a geological event that will reshape North America and alter global climate for years to come. This is Dr. Wesley Grant broadcasting from an underground research facility in New Mexico. 30 days have passed since the Yellowstone Eruption began, and the world above ground has become unrecognizable. I'm transmitting through a network of emergency radio relays, as most communication infrastructure has failed under the weight of continuous ashfall and electromagnetic interference. The surface temperature here, 800 miles from the eruption site, has dropped 23 degrees from seasonal averages. What we're experiencing is the onset of a volcanic winter that may persist for years. The eruption has now ejected over 500 cubic miles of material, matching the scale of the Toba eruption that occurred 74,000 years ago in Indonesia. That event reduced the global human population to perhaps 3,000 individuals, creating a genetic bottleneck that still influences human DNA today. The Yellowstone eruption is following similar patterns, with atmospheric sulfur dioxide concentrations reaching levels not seen in recorded history. These particles form aerosols in the stratosphere that reflect solar radiation back into space, effectively dimming the sun for the entire planet. Global average temperatures have dropped 7 degrees Fahrenheit in just 1 month. This cooling is not uniform, but varies by latitude and geography, creating chaotic weather patterns that meteorologists struggle to predict. The monsoon systems that provide water for 3 billion people in Asia have shifted dramatically, bringing drought to regions that depend on seasonal rains. Arctic air masses are penetrating further south than ever recorded, bringing snow to areas that haven't seen winter precipitation in living memory. The kill zone around Yellowstone extends approximately 600 miles in all directions from the caldera. Within this area, nothing larger than bacteria survives on the surface. The landscape has been transformed into an alien environment of ash dunes and steaming fissures. Satellite imagery shows a gray wasteland where forests, cities, and farmland once existed. The ash deposits reach depths of 30 feet near the eruption center, gradually diminishing to several feet at the zone's periphery. These deposits are not stable, but shift with wind patterns, creating moving dunes that bury and expose features unpredictably. Denver, Colorado sits at the edge of the kill zone, buried under 10 feet of ash that continues to accumulate with each wind shift. The city's 3 million residents evacuated during the first week of the eruption, but the evacuation was incomplete and chaotic. Thousands of vehicles were abandoned on highways as ashfall made driving impossible. The ash mixed with rain to create a concrete-like substance that hardened around abandoned cars, preserving them like insects in amber. The city's skyscrapers now appear as islands rising from a gray sea, their lower floors completely buried. Agricultural regions across the Great Plains have experienced complete crop failure. The ashfall destroyed growing plants immediately, while residual particles in soil make replanting impossible without extensive remediation. Wheat fields that fed millions now lie beneath inches of abrasive volcanic glass. Livestock operations have ceased entirely in affected areas as animals cannot survive breathing the ash-laden air. The United States has lost approximately 60% of its agricultural capacity, triggering food shortages that ripple through global markets. The technological infrastructure of modern civilization is proving remarkably vulnerable to volcanic ash. Data centers that power internet services have shut down as cooling systems become clogged with particles. The ash is electrically conductive when wet, creating short circuits in power grids across multiple states. GPS satellites remain functional, but ground-based receivers struggle with signal interference caused by ash particles in the atmosphere. The modern world's dependence on electronic systems becomes a liability when those systems cannot function in post-eruption conditions. Aircraft remain grounded across most of North America, as volcanic ash turns jet engines into expensive sculptures when the particles melt and re-solidify on turbine blades. The few aircraft that attempted to fly through ash clouds experienced complete engine failure within minutes. International air travel has been disrupted globally as ash clouds circle the planet at high altitude. Shipping continues on ocean routes, but port facilities in affected regions have ceased operations due to equipment failures and worker safety concerns. Human health impacts are mounting as respiratory diseases overwhelm medical systems. Volcanic ash causes silicosis, a progressive lung disease that develops from inhaling crystalline particles. Hospital emergency rooms report hundreds of cases daily of acute respiratory distress, particularly among children and elderly individuals. Surgical masks provide minimal protection against particles smaller than bacteria. Effective protection requires industrial respirators that most civilians do not possess. Medical facilities themselves struggle to maintain sterile conditions as ash infiltrates ventilation systems. The psychological trauma of living under perpetual darkness affects entire populations. Children who experience blue skies now accept gray twilight as normal. Adults struggle with depression and anxiety as the familiar rhythms of day and night disappear under ash clouds that block 90% of sunlight. Sleep patterns become disrupted when biological clocks cannot detect natural light cycles. Wildlife populations have collapsed across vast areas of North America. Migratory birds that depend on visual navigation become disoriented in the perpetual twilight and ash storms. Large mammals that survived the initial eruption now face starvation as vegetation dies from lack of sunlight. Aquatic ecosystems suffer as ash fall acidifies water bodies and clogs fish gills. The food chain collapses from the bottom up as primary producers cannot photosynthesize in the reduced light conditions. Ocean temperatures are dropping as reduced solar heating affects global circulation patterns. The Gulf Stream that moderates European climate shows signs of weakening, threatening to plunge Western Europe into much colder conditions. Coral reefs experience mass bleaching events as water temperatures fall below their survival thresholds. Marine ecosystems that support billions of people face disruption that may persist for decades, long after the eruption itself ends. International borders have become meaningless as nation-states struggle to maintain basic governmental functions. Military forces are overwhelmed, providing humanitarian assistance to their own populations and cannot patrol territorial boundaries effectively. Refugee populations in the tens of millions move across former borders seeking regions less affected by ashfall. Traditional international cooperation breaks down as each nation prioritizes its own survival over global stability. The economic systems that organize modern life have effectively ceased functioning in affected regions. Financial markets closed during the first week of the eruption and show no signs of reopening as the scope of economic damage becomes apparent. Currency loses meaning when basic necessities become unavailable at any price. Barter systems emerge in surviving communities as people trade skills and resources directly without monetary intermediation. The complex supply chains that deliver food and goods to modern populations have completely collapsed. Energy production faces severe challenges as ash infiltrates power generation facilities. Coal and natural gas plants shut down as ash clogs air intake systems and damages turbine equipment. Nuclear facilities operate on backup power as external electrical grids fail, raising concerns about long-term safety as emergency systems are tested beyond design limits. Solar panels become useless under thick ash deposits, while wind turbines suffer blade damage from abrasive particles in the air. Underground facilities like this research station represent humanity's temporary refuge from surface conditions. We maintain air filtration systems that remove ash particles, allowing human habitation in controlled environments. Food supplies consist of emergency rations that may last several months if carefully rationed. Water comes from deep wells that remain uncontaminated by surface ash. These underground communities may represent the future of human habitation, until surface conditions improve enough to support life again. Scientific instruments continue monitoring the eruption's progress, though many surface stations have been destroyed or rendered inoperable. Seismic data indicates the magma chamber is far from empty, suggesting months of continued eruption activity. Ground deformation measurements show the caldera is still collapsing as more material is ejected. Gas emission rates remain at catastrophic levels, pumping additional sulfur compounds into the stratosphere that will extend the volcanic winter. The Yellowstone eruption has fundamentally altered Earth's climate system in ways that may persist for decades. Ice cores from previous supervolcanic eruptions show climate disruption lasting up to 10 years after major events. The current eruption exceeds most historical examples in scale and intensity, suggesting recovery periods measured in decades rather than years. Humanity faces adaptation to a planet with permanently altered weather patterns, reduced agricultural capacity, and disrupted ecosystems. As I conclude this transmission, ash continues falling outside our underground refuge. Each particle represents rock that was solid bedrock 6 weeks ago, vaporized and distributed across continents by forces beyond human control. We are witnessing geological processes that have shaped Earth for billions of years, indifferent to human civilization and technology. The planet continues its ancient rhythms, while humanity struggles to adapt to changes that occur on timescales far beyond individual human experience. This is Dr. Wesley Grant, transmitting on day 120 of the Yellowstone eruption. My equipment functions sporadically now, powered by failing battery reserves and makeshift solar collectors that capture what little sunlight penetrates the ash-laden atmosphere. The volcanic winter has deepened beyond our worst projections. Global temperatures have dropped 12 degrees below pre-eruption averages, triggering ice sheet expansion at rates not seen since the last glacial period. What we're experiencing represents a fundamental shift in Earth's climate system that may persist for decades. The eruption entered what volcanologists call the long phase 6 weeks ago, transitioning from explosive ejection to sustained lava flows and continuous gas emission. The magma chamber, which we estimated contained 15,000 cubic miles of molten material, continues draining through multiple vents across the collapsed caldera. Lava flows now cover an area larger than Rhode Island, creating a hellscape of molten rock that glows red against the perpetual twilight. These flows advance at walking pace, but consume everything in their path with temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Seismic monitoring stations that remain operational record constant tremors as the caldera system continues adjusting to the massive evacuation of material. Secondary vents have opened hundreds of miles from the original eruption site, following ancient fracture systems in the continental crust. A new volcanic fissure opened in eastern Montana last week, ejecting gas and ash in a minor eruption that would have been considered catastrophic under normal circumstances. The Yellowstone system is revealing its true extent as magma finds new pathways to the surface. Atmospheric chemistry has been permanently altered by the continuous injection of volcanic gases into the stratosphere. Sulfur dioxide concentrations remain at levels that were unprecedented in recorded history. These compounds form aerosol particles that circle the globe multiple times before settling, creating a persistent veil that blocks solar radiation. Spectral analysis of sunlight reaching the surface shows dramatic reduction in wavelengths necessary for photosynthesis, effectively starving plant life across the planet. The collapse of photosynthesis has triggered what biologists are calling the sixth mass extinction. Primary producers that form the base of all food webs cannot survive with less than 10% of normal sunlight levels. Forests across the northern hemisphere are dying en masse, their leaves brown and withered despite adequate moisture. Grasslands that once fed millions of grazing animals now resemble moonscapes of dead vegetation. Ocean phytoplankton populations have crashed, disrupting marine food webs that support billions of people. Agricultural civilization has effectively ended across large portions of North America and much of the northern hemisphere. Growing seasons have been eliminated by persistent sub-freezing temperatures that extend well into traditionally warm months. Soil temperatures remain below freezing, even in southern regions that normally experience subtropical climates. The few attempts at greenhouse agriculture fail as heating costs become prohibitive and structural damage from ash accumulation makes buildings uninhabitable. Human population displacement has reached scales that overwhelm any historical comparison. Conservative estimates suggest 150 million people have been forced from their homes in North America alone. Refugee camps intended for thousands now house hundreds of thousands in conditions that deteriorate daily. International refugee movements have triggered border conflicts as nations struggle to accommodate populations fleeing uninhabitable regions. The social contracts that organize modern civilization break down under pressures no government was designed to handle. Medical systems have collapsed under the combined burden of respiratory diseases, malnutrition, and exposure-related illnesses. Silicosis cases number in the millions, creating a permanent disabled population requiring constant medical care that no longer exists. Vitamin D deficiency has become widespread as reduced sunlight prevents normal synthesis of this essential nutrient. Rickets, a disease eliminated in developed nations decades ago, reappears in children who have never experienced adequate sunlight. Mental health services are overwhelmed by depression and anxiety cases related to the perpetual darkness. Urban centers have become uninhabitable monuments to a technological civilization that proved remarkably fragile. Chicago sits under 6 feet of ash that continues accumulating with each weather system. The city's famous skyline now appears as geometric shapes protruding from gray dunes that shift with prevailing winds. Looters and scavengers work through abandoned buildings, searching for supplies that become more valuable than currency. Fire departments ceased operations weeks ago as water systems failed and equipment became clogged with ash particles. Infrastructure decay accelerates under conditions no engineer anticipated during design phases. Bridges experience unprecedented stress as ash accumulation adds millions of tons of weight to structures never intended to bear such loads. Several major spans have collapsed, cutting transportation links between surviving communities. Highway systems remain impassable, not just from ash accumulation, but from freeze-thaw cycles that crack pavement as temperatures fluctuate around freezing. The interstate highway system that connected a continent has become a network of abandoned ruins. Power generation has ceased across most affected regions as coal plants cannot operate with ash-contaminated fuel and cooling water. Nuclear facilities operate in emergency mode, their cooling systems struggling with debris-laden water and reduced electrical grid support. Hydroelectric dams face new challenges as ash-filled reservoirs reduce water flow and damage turbine equipment. The electrical grid that powered modern life has been replaced by isolated generator systems that operate when fuel remains available. Communication networks continue degrading as maintenance becomes impossible under surface conditions. Cell towers buried in ash cannot transmit effectively, while satellite communications suffer interference from atmospheric particles. The internet, which connected global civilization, has fragmented into isolated networks serving underground facilities and hardened installations. Information flow, which modern society depends upon for coordination and decision-making, has been reduced to primitive radio transmissions like this broadcast. Access to safe drinking water, the most basic requirement for human survival, has become a luxury available only to those with deep wells or extensive filtration systems. Wildlife populations that survived the initial eruption now face systematic starvation as food webs collapse. Large mammals that migrated south from the kill zone compete for diminishing resources in regions experiencing their own ecological collapse. Predator populations have crashed as prey species disappear, while scavenger species initially thrived on the abundance of carrion, but now face starvation as even dead animals become scarce. The complex ecosystems that took millions of years to evolve are disappearing within months. Ocean circulation patterns show signs of fundamental disruption as temperature gradients drive global current systems. The thermohaline circulation that moderates global climate by distributing heat between polar and equatorial regions has weakened significantly. This weakening threatens to trigger additional cooling as warm water no longer reaches northern latitudes effectively. Marine ecosystems already stressed by temperature changes face additional pressure from altered nutrient distribution and oxygen levels. International governance has become meaningless as nation-states focus entirely on internal survival. The United Nations has ceased meeting as member nations cannot maintain diplomatic operations. International trade has virtually stopped, not from political decisions, but from the practical impossibility of maintaining commercial relationships when basic infrastructure no longer functions. The global economy that connected every nation has been replaced by localized barter systems and subsistence communities. Underground facilities like this research station represent isolated pockets of technological civilization maintained through careful resource management and environmental control. Our air filtration systems require constant maintenance to prevent ash infiltration, while food stores diminish according to calculations that show shortages within months. The psychological stress of confinement, combined with awareness of surface conditions, creates tension among residents that threatens the cooperation necessary for survival. Scientific observation continues despite equipment failures and limited communication with other research facilities. The data we're collecting documents one of the most significant geological events in human history, potentially valuable for future generations if any survive to interpret the records. Volcanic gas emissions show no signs of decreasing, suggesting the eruption may continue for years rather than months. The magma chamber's capacity exceeds our initial estimates, indicating more material awaits ejection. Temperature measurements show ice sheet expansion occurring much faster than climate models predicted for gradual cooling events. The rapid onset of volcanic winter has triggered feedback mechanisms that amplify cooling effects. Snow and ice that accumulate under the ash-darkened skies reflect additional heat back into space, creating a runaway cooling process. Permafrost that has remained stable for thousands of years shows signs of expansion into regions where it never existed during recorded history. As I prepare to conclude this transmission, our facility's power systems indicate critical battery levels that may not support future broadcasts. The equipment that enables these transmissions represents one of the last links between scattered human communities across a continent transformed beyond recognition. Each transmission becomes more precious as the means of communication dwindle, and the isolation of survival communities becomes complete. We are witnessing the end of an interconnected world and the beginning of something entirely different. This is Dr. Wesley Grant broadcasting what may be my final transmission on day 365 of the Yellowstone Eruption. 1 full year has passed since the supervolcano awakened, and the world that existed before that morning no longer recognizes itself. My equipment operates on the last reserves of power, cobbled together from salvaged components and failing solar collectors that capture mere whispers of sunlight through the perpetual ash veil. The volcanic winter has deepened into something approaching a new ice age, with global temperatures now 15 degrees below pre-eruption averages. The eruption has finally begun showing signs of decline after 14 months of sustained activity. Seismic data indicates the magma chamber has released approximately 800 cubic miles of material, exceeding even the Toba eruption that nearly extinguished humanity 74,000 years ago. Lava flows continue, but at reduced rates, while gas emissions have decreased to levels that allow cautious optimism about atmospheric recovery beginning within decades rather than years. The caldera now spans 45 miles across, a wound in the Earth's surface that will remain visible for millions of years. Continental ice sheets have expanded at rates that rewrite glaciology textbooks. The Laurentide ice sheet, which disappeared 10,000 years ago, has begun reforming across eastern Canada and the northern United States. Glacial ice now extends south into Minnesota and Wisconsin, advancing at rates of several miles per year. This expansion occurs not through gradual accumulation, but through the transformation of existing snowpack into permanent ice under conditions of perpetual winter. We may be witnessing the onset of a new glacial period triggered by volcanic forcing. Atmospheric chemistry shows the beginning of a slow recovery process that will span generations. Sulfur dioxide concentrations in the stratosphere have decreased by 30% from peak levels, allowing approximately 20% of normal sunlight to reach Earth's surface. This increase, while minimal, enables limited photosynthesis in hardy plant species adapted to low-light conditions. Volcanic aerosols continue circling the globe, but show signs of settling that suggest gradual atmospheric clearing over the next 2 to 3 decades. Human population has been reduced by an estimated 2 to 3 billion people through direct casualties, starvation, disease, and exposure. This represents the largest population decline in human history, approaching the genetic bottleneck that occurred during the Toba eruption. Survivors concentrate in underground facilities, southern hemisphere locations less affected by ashfall, and isolated communities that successfully adapted to post-eruption conditions. The complex technological civilization that supported 8 billion people has been replaced by subsistence communities numbering in the thousands. Agricultural recovery shows tentative signs of possibility in regions that escaped direct ashfall and maintain temperatures above freezing for portions of the year. Greenhouse cultivation using artificial lighting represents the primary method of food production, though energy requirements limit such operations to communities with reliable power generation. Seed banks maintained in underground facilities may allow eventual restoration of crop varieties when surface conditions improve, though this recovery will require decades of careful cultivation and soil remediation. Ecosystem collapse has created a simplified biosphere dominated by species adapted to harsh conditions and limited food resources. Boreal forest species that survived in southern refugia during previous ice ages show signs of expansion into regions where temperate forests once flourished. Tundra vegetation spreads across areas that supported diverse ecosystems before the eruption. The complex food webs that characterized pre-eruption ecosystems have been replaced by simplified communities of hardy survivors. Ocean systems continue adjusting to fundamentally altered temperature and chemistry conditions. Thermohaline circulation has weakened to levels not seen since the last glacial maximum, reducing heat transport to northern latitudes and amplifying regional cooling. Marine ecosystems show signs of adaptation to new thermal regimes, with cold water species expanding their ranges, while tropical species retreat toward equatorial refugia. Coral reef systems have collapsed across vast areas, though some deep water communities persist in thermal spring environments. Technological infrastructure that survived the initial eruption continues degrading without maintenance capabilities. Satellite networks show increasing failure rates as orbital debris from atmospheric disturbances damages equipment and ground-based control systems become inoperable. The global positioning system maintains partial functionality, though accuracy has decreased significantly. Communication satellites that enable these transmissions operate beyond their designed lifespans without replacement possibilities. Underground communities represent the primary preservation of human knowledge and technological capability. These facilities maintain libraries, scientific equipment, and manufacturing capabilities that may enable eventual reconstruction of technological civilization. Population pressures within confined spaces create social tensions, but also force cooperation necessary for long-term survival. Scientific research continues within the constraints of limited resources and equipment failures. Data collected during the eruption provides unprecedented documentation of supervolcanic processes and their global impacts. This information may prove invaluable for understanding geological cycles and preparing for future eruptions, assuming human civilization survives to utilize such knowledge. Volcanic monitoring systems that remain functional show decreasing activity levels that suggest the eruption phase is ending. Climate modeling indicates the volcanic winter will persist for at least another decade before atmospheric clearing allows significant warming. Ice sheet expansion may continue for several decades due to feedback mechanisms that maintain cooling even after volcanic aerosols settle. Recovery to pre-eruption climate conditions appears unlikely within centuries, suggesting permanent alteration of Earth's climate system. Humanity faces adaptation to a planet fundamentally changed by geological forces. Geographic changes created by the eruption will influence human settlement patterns for millennia. The former Yellowstone region remains uninhabitable and may require centuries for basic ecosystem recovery. Ash deposits across the central United States create altered landscapes that affect drainage patterns, soil chemistry, and agricultural potential. River systems have been permanently modified by ash deposition and altered precipitation patterns, requiring adaptation of water management systems. Social structures that organized pre-eruption civilization have been replaced by small-scale communities focused on immediate survival needs. Democratic institutions cannot function when populations lack basic necessities and communication systems. Leadership emerges through practical skills rather than political processes, with authority based on ability to provide security and resources. Cultural transmission occurs through oral tradition rather than written records, as printed materials become too valuable for preservation. Genetic diversity in surviving human populations has been severely reduced, creating founder effects that will influence human evolution for thousands of generations. Isolated communities may develop distinct genetic characteristics through drift and selection pressures related to post-eruption environmental conditions. The global genetic mixing that characterized modern civilization has been replaced by isolated breeding populations that face the challenges of maintaining genetic health with limited population sizes. Economic systems based on monetary exchange have been replaced by direct resource allocation and barter arrangements. Currency becomes meaningless when basic survival needs cannot be purchased at any price. Labor specialization disappears as everyone must contribute to immediate survival tasks rather than pursuing narrow professional skills. The complex supply chains that supported global commerce have been replaced by local production of essential goods using available materials. Archaeological evidence suggests that previous supervolcanic eruptions triggered similar civilizational collapses and population bottlenecks throughout human prehistory. The Toba eruption created genetic signatures still visible in modern human populations, indicating that small groups of survivors can eventually repopulate continents given sufficient time. Current conditions parallel those ancient catastrophes, suggesting possible recovery pathways that operate on timescales measured in millennia rather than decades. The isolation of underground life tests human psychological limits as contact with other survivors becomes sporadic and uncertain. Each broadcast may be the last opportunity to add to the scientific record of this unprecedented event. The responsibility of documentation weighs heavily when realizing these transmissions may represent the only detailed account of civilization's transformation. As I conclude this final transmission, I reflect on the profound forces that shape our planet over geological time. The Yellowstone eruption represents a natural process that has repeated throughout Earth's history, indifferent to human presence or technological achievement. Previous eruptions occurred when only bacteria witnessed their power, while this event coincided with human civilization's peak complexity. We have documented our own transformation from technological masters to geological survivors. The data collected during this eruption will serve future generations in understanding volcanic processes and their impacts on climate and life. Assuming human civilization recovers sufficiently to interpret this information, the scientific record we've maintained may help prepare for future supervolcanic events. The 640,000-year cycle that governs Yellowstone eruptions suggests our descendants may face similar challenges, though perhaps with better preparation and understanding. Life persists even under the most extreme conditions, and human adaptability may enable survival through this geological catastrophe. Small communities scattered across the planet maintain the knowledge and genetic diversity necessary for eventual recovery. Children born into this new world will adapt to conditions we consider impossible, potentially developing the resilience needed for long-term survival in a transformed environment. My equipment is failing now, and this transmission ends as power reserves reach critical levels. The silence that follows may persist for years or decades until communication systems recover sufficiently to resume contact between surviving communities. Until then, we remain witnesses to one of Earth's most powerful processes, observers of the forces that have shaped our planet for billions of years, participants in a geological event that will influence evolution for millions of years to come. This is Dr. Wesley Grant signing off. Remember that this eruption, devastating as it appears to human timescales, represents just one moment in Earth's long history. Life has survived worse catastrophes and will continue long after this volcanic winter ends. We are not the end of the story, but perhaps the beginning of a new chapter in human adaptation to the dynamic planet we call home.